The muddy waters of the Missouri River lapped against the weathered dock as Hannah Lewis stepped off the steamboat, clutching her small leather valise in one hand and her sleeping 4-year-old daughter Sarah to her chest with the other. The late autumn wind whipped at her skirts as she surveyed Virginia City's bustling waterfront, her heart pounding with equal measures of hope and trepidation. The correspondence with Andrew Wright had promised a fresh start, but her letters had carefully omitted certain truths about her past and about Sarah's heritage. The town sprawled before her, a maze of wooden buildings and muddy streets climbing the riverbank like wooden steps. Steam rose from the riverboat stacks behind her, mingling with the morning fog that clung to the water. Hannah adjusted Sarah's weight against her hip, the child's dark curls and copper-toned skin a stark contrast to her own fair features. She had prayed daily that Andrew would see past their differences, would embrace them both as family despite the obvious signs of Sarah's mixed parentage. Through the crowd of dock workers and merchants, Hannah spotted a tall man in a black coat who could only be Andrew Wright. His letters had described his appearance precisely: broad-shouldered, sandy-haired, with a neatly trimmed mustache. But as their eyes met across the busy wharf, Hannah saw the immediate change in his expression. The welcoming smile faltered, his gaze fixing on Sarah with unmistakable shock and displeasure. "Miss Lewis," Andrew said stiffly when she approached, his voice carrying none of the warmth from his letters. He barely glanced at Hannah, his attention locked on the sleeping child. "You failed to mention certain circumstances in our correspondence." The words fell between them like stones, each one crushing Hannah's carefully constructed hopes for their future together. She felt her face flush with shame and anger, though she'd known this moment might come. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension radiating from their encounter. Hannah heard the whispers, saw the judgmental stares. She'd endured such looks before, but here, hundreds of miles from anything familiar, they cut deeper. Sarah stirred against her shoulder, and Hannah instinctively turned to shield her daughter from the growing spectacle. "Mr. Wright, if you'll allow me to explain—" "There's nothing to explain," Andrew cut her off, taking a step back as if her very presence might taint him. "I cannot marry a woman who would—" He trailed off, his meaning clear in the disgust twisting his features. "The arrangement is void. Good day, Miss Lewis." With that, he turned and strode away, leaving Hannah standing alone on the dock with her daughter and their meager belongings, the curious onlookers still whispering and pointing. Among the faces in the crowd, one stood out. A man with weathered features and dark eyes that held neither judgment nor pity, but something closer to understanding. He wore buckskins and a well-worn hat, his mixed heritage as evident as Sarah's. The stranger watched the scene unfold with quiet intensity, and when their eyes met briefly, Hannah felt an unexpected flicker of hope. This was John Harris, though she wouldn't learn his name until later that day, when he became their unlikely salvation. The afternoon found Hannah sitting in a corner of the River Queen Hotel's dining room, counting the few coins remaining in her purse, while Sarah colored quietly beside her with a stub of charcoal on a scrap of paper. They had enough for perhaps 2 nights' lodging, but after that, their future stretched before them like the vast unknown territory beyond the river. The other diners gave their table a wide berth, their disapproving glances a constant reminder of their precarious position. John Harris entered the hotel dining room, just as Hannah was considering their dwindling options. He moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating hostile territory, both in the wilderness and in towns where his presence was barely tolerated. Without asking permission, he pulled out a chair at their table and sat down, his dark eyes meeting Hannah's startled gaze with calm directness. "I'm a scout for the Army," he said without preamble, his voice low and gravelly. "Got a cabin upriver, near the Blackfoot trading post. It ain't much, but it's quiet and safe. You and the little one need a place to weather this storm." It wasn't a question, but neither was it a demand. He laid his proposition out like a map between them, letting Hannah trace the path herself. Sarah looked up from her drawing, studying John with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. Hannah studied John's weathered face, searching for any hint of deception. Years of hardship had taught her to be wary of kindness from strangers, but there was something in his steady gaze that spoke of shared understanding. The late afternoon sun filtering through the hotel's grimy windows cast long shadows across their table, And in that muted light, she could see the same mixture of worlds in his features that she saw every day in her daughter's face. "Why would you help us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah had returned to her drawing, but Hannah noticed how the child's small fingers gripped the pencil tighter, aware of the tension in her mother's voice. The dining room had grown quieter, other patrons straining to eavesdrop on their conversation. John's calloused hands remained flat on the table, his posture deliberately non-threatening. "Because I've seen how Virginia City treats those who don't fit their neat categories," he replied. "The Trading Post needs someone who can keep books and handle correspondence. The Blackfoot trust me, but they prefer dealing with women when it comes to trade negotiations. You'd have work, shelter, and no one asking questions about what came before." The mention of Virginia City sent a chill down Hannah's spine. Word traveled fast along the river, and it wouldn't be long before Matthew's men traced their path from that town. She'd seen the telegram in his hand just before they fled, the one revealing her daughter's true parentage, and the cold fury in his eyes had told her everything about his intentions. Sarah looked up from her paper, pushing it across the table toward John. The crude drawing showed 3 figures: a woman, a child, and a man standing near what appeared to be a house by water. "Is there a creek near your cabin?" she asked, her small voice carrying the hope that only children can maintain in dark times. "Mama used to tell me stories about playing in the creek when she was little." John's expression softened as he examined the drawing. "There's a whole network of streams," he answered, meeting the child's eager gaze. "Good fishing, too, if you've got the patience for it." He glanced at Hannah, adding, "The cabin's about 2 days' ride upriver. We'd need to leave at first light to stay ahead of the weather, and anything else that might be following." The weight of the decision pressed down on Hannah like a physical thing. They had enough money for perhaps 3 more nights at the hotel, and then what? Matthew's influence stretched through every proper town along the river, his shipping business giving him eyes and ears at every port. The respectable life she'd hoped to build was crumbling, but perhaps here was a chance to build something different, something real. "The work at the Trading Post," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Would it be enough to save something? For Sarah's future?" The question carried all her fears and hopes, the desperate need to give her daughter more than a life of running and hiding. John nodded slowly, understanding the layers beneath her question. "The Post does well enough. The Blackfoot bring in good furs, and there's always river traffic needing supplies. Between that and what I make scouting, we could set aside a proper stake for the girls' schooling." He paused, then added with quiet certainty, "And Matthew's reach doesn't extend into Blackfoot territory. They don't recognize his kind of authority." The mention of Matthew's name made Hannah's hand tremble as she reached for her teacup. He'd seemed so perfect in his letters, a successful businessman in Virginia City, promising a respectable life for a widow and her child. The reality had been far different, his genteel manner cracking the moment he'd discovered Sarah's heritage. Now his wounded pride would accept nothing less than possessing them both, proving his ownership over what he saw as his property. Outside, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the river's surface in shades of gold and crimson. The dinner crowd was thinning, and Hannah could feel the growing urgency of their situation. Each moment they lingered increased the chance of discovery, of someone recognizing them from the descriptions Matthew would surely be circulating. "We'll need supplies," she said finally, her decision made. "And I'll have to settle our bill here without drawing attention." The practical details helped steady her voice, gave her something concrete to focus on beyond the fear. John rose smoothly from his chair, his movements still carrying that careful grace. "I'll see to the supplies and horses. Meet me at the livery stable an hour before dawn. Pack light. We can get what you need at the Trading Post." He hesitated, then added softly, "I give you my word, Hannah. No harm will come to either of you while you're under my protection." Hannah Young clutched her daughter Grace's small hand as they made their way along the muddy banks of the Missouri River, the morning fog wrapping around them like a ghostly shawl. The Trading Post of Virginia City loomed ahead, a collection of weathered buildings perched precariously on the riverbank. Her heart pounded with each step closer to what she prayed would be her salvation. A new life with Matthew Harris, the merchant who had promised marriage through their exchange of letters. The reality that greeted her was far from the warm welcome she had imagined. Matthew Harris's face had twisted with disgust when he saw Grace's copper-toned skin and dark eyes, evidence of Hannah's previous marriage to a Cherokee trader. His words still rang in her ears. "I won't raise another man's half-breed child. You deceived me." He had turned his back on them both, leaving them stranded with nothing but a few dollars and their travel-worn belongings. John Wright, a half-Sioux scout who frequented the trading post, witnessed the cruel rejection. Something in Hannah's quiet dignity and Grace's innocent confusion stirred memories of his own mother's struggles. Despite his reputation as a loner who preferred the company of wilderness to people, he found himself offering them shelter at his modest cabin upriver, away from the judgmental stares of Virginia City's residents. The cabin proved to be a sanctuary of unexpected peace. John taught Grace to fish in the clear waters and identify medicinal plants in the surrounding woods, while Hannah's skilled hands transformed the sparse interior into a real home. For the first time since her first husband's death, Hannah felt the tentative stirrings of hope. John's gentle ways with Grace and his respectful distance with her made her wonder if fate had led them to something better than what she'd originally sought. But Matthew Harris's wounded pride festered like a poison. He had invested money in Hannah's travel arrangements and considered both her and Grace his property by right of contract. In the smoky confines of the River Queen Saloon, he struck a deal with the notorious King brothers, David and Michael, offering them a substantial bounty to bring back what he claimed was rightfully his. The brothers' reputation for ruthless efficiency was well known along the river territories. David King watched Hannah from the tree line as she hung laundry outside John's cabin, memorizing her routine. His brother Michael studied the patterns of John's scout work, noting when the half-breed was likely to be away. They were professional bounty hunters who prided themselves on careful planning. But something about this job felt different. The way the little girl played freely around the cabin, her laughter carrying on the wind, made David question their usual methods. The tension began to mount as John noticed signs of being watched, broken twigs where there shouldn't be any, the unnatural silence of birds in previously active areas. He taught Hannah to use his spare rifle, though her hands trembled at first. Grace was no longer allowed to play beyond the cabin's immediate vicinity, and the carefree atmosphere of their early days together began to fade under the weight of constant vigilance. Word reached them through Andrew Lewis, a sympathetic riverboat captain, that Matthew Harris had been bragging about hiring help to settle a matter of honor. The news sent Hannah into a spiral of anxiety, remembering how her first husband's murder had been dismissed as a matter of honor by white authorities. She began to plan an escape downriver to Laredo, where she had distant relatives, but John convinced her that running would only make them more vulnerable. Instead, John drew upon his years of experience in both worlds, white and native, to prepare for what was coming. He called in favors from other scouts and river traders who owed him, creating a network of eyes and ears along the waterway. Hannah discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed, keeping watch with steady hands while John made his supply runs, teaching Grace to stay quiet and still when strangers approached the river. The King brothers were surprised to find their usual tactics of intimidation met with an organized resistance. Their attempts to isolate the cabin were thwarted by river traders who suddenly found reasons to make frequent stops nearby. Even the local law, previously indifferent to such matters, began paying unusual attention to their movements after John provided information about their connection to other unsolved bounty cases. The river brought whispers of trouble one humid evening when a trade barge docked with news that made John's jaw tighten. The King brothers had been seen meeting with Matthew Carter, a notorious tracker from Virginia City, whose reputation for finding people was matched only by his indifference to human suffering. Hannah watched John's face as he absorbed this intelligence, noting how his weathered features seemed to age years in moments. That night, as Grace slept peacefully in her small bed, Hannah and John spoke in hushed tones by lamplight. "Matthew won't stop until he finds us," John explained, his fingers tracing paths along a worn map spread across the table. "He's different from the Kings. He thinks like the land itself, reading signs most men would miss." Hannah's hand found his across the weathered parchment, their shared warmth a quiet defiance against the growing darkness. The next few days brought changes to their small sanctuary. John taught Hannah to read tracks and identify which broken branches were left by animals versus men. She learned to distinguish between the natural silence of the woods and the artificial quiet that meant someone was watching. Grace, despite her young age, seemed to sense the gravity of their situation, no longer needing to be reminded to stay close to the cabin. When Andrew, one of John's most trusted river contacts, arrived with supplies, he brought more than just provisions. Hidden among the sacks of flour and dried goods were extra ammunition and 2 fine Winchester rifles. A gift from some friends in Santa Fe, Andrew explained with a meaningful look. They remember how you helped their families during the drought last season. The weapons represented more than just protection. They were a testament to the connections John had built over years of honest dealing. Hannah found herself drawn to the river at dawn and dusk, watching the water's endless flow while Grace played quietly nearby. The child's mixed heritage, once a source of shame thrust upon her by others' prejudices, now seemed to Hannah like a beautiful embodiment of the two worlds that John bridged so naturally. She saw how the river itself didn't discriminate, carrying all boats equally on its broad shoulders. The peaceful routine was shattered one afternoon when Victoria, a young woman from the nearest trading post, arrived breathless with warning. Matthew Carter had been seen in Amarillo, asking questions about river routes and recent traveler patterns. More disturbing was the news that he'd brought with him papers claiming legal custody of Grace, documents that, though falsified, would look convincing to any local authority not inclined to look too closely at their authenticity. John spent that evening teaching Hannah the secret paths that wound through the riverside thickets, trails known only to those who had learned the land's hidden language. If anything happens, he instructed, his voice carrying the weight of years spent surviving, follow the bend past the 3 fallen cottonwoods, then head east through the shallow water. There's a place. He hesitated, then continued. A place where my mother's people still live. They'll shelter you both. The air grew thick with tension as summer heat built along the river valley. Hannah noticed John taking longer routes during his scouting, doubling back and crossing the water multiple times to confuse any trailing eyes. She practiced loading and unloading the Winchester until her fingers could perform the motion in darkness, all while keeping her ears tuned to Grace's breathing as the child slept nearby. One morning, Hannah found John staring intently at tracks leading down to their small dock. Without a word, he pointed to the subtle signs she might have missed weeks ago: the slight displacement of river mud, the bent stalks of marsh grass. Someone had been watching their cabin in the night. The tracks belonged to 2 different men, and one set matched the description of Matthew Carter's distinctive boot heel that John had warned her about. They began moving their essential supplies to caches hidden along their escape route, preparing for the inevitable while maintaining the appearance of normal life. Grace, showing wisdom beyond her years, never questioned why her favorite doll and warmest blanket now lived in a waterproof bag ready by the door. The child's quiet acceptance of their situation sometimes brought tears to Hannah's eyes, but also strengthened her resolve to protect the new family they had built. The autumn air grew sharper as John intensified their survival training, teaching Hannah to read the river's moods and navigate by starlight. During these lessons, she noticed how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, his body tense like a coiled spring. His vigilance was justified when they discovered fresh cigarette butts near their woodpile, a careless sign from men who thought themselves too clever to be detected. Through whispered conversations after Grace was asleep, Hannah learned more about Matthew Carter's reputation. The man had connections throughout the river settlements, using his wealth from the Santa Fe trade routes to buy influence and information. John's past dealings with Carter had left him with a deep understanding of the man's ruthless nature, though he kept the specifics of their history carefully guarded. One afternoon, while Grace helped John mend fishing nets, a seemingly innocent trading boat pulled up to their dock. The crew's questions about local hunting grounds didn't mask their careful study of the cabin's layout. Hannah recognized the practiced way they noted escape routes and defensive positions. These were not simple rivermen. The thundering hooves echoed across the valley as Matthew Wright and his band of hired guns approached the riverside trading post. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cottonwoods, glinting off their rifles and revolvers. Hannah Lewis clutched her young daughter Grace tightly as she watched from the upstairs window of John Harris's modest home, her heart pounding. She knew they had finally found her, just as she had feared they would. John Harris, the half-Cherokee scout who had given them sanctuary these past months, calmly checked his Winchester rifle while studying the approaching riders. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but Hannah could see the tension in his shoulders. He had known this day would come ever since he first took them in, when they arrived desperate and alone after Matthew Wright had publicly rejected Hannah upon discovering her mixed-race child. Stay inside with Grace, John instructed softly, his dark eyes meeting Hannah's. Whatever happens, remember what we discussed. Hannah nodded, fighting back tears as she remembered the escape route John had shown her. A hidden tunnel leading from the cellar to a cave by the river where a small boat was kept ready. It pained her that this gentle man who had become so dear to them might now pay the price for his kindness. The riders reined up in a cloud of dust, Matthew Wright's familiar figure dismounting first. His once handsome face was twisted with bitterness as he surveyed the trading post that had been John's home and livelihood for over a decade. "Harris!" he bellowed. "Send out my property and we'll leave peaceful-like. Otherwise, things are going to get mighty unpleasant." His men spread out, taking positions behind wagon wheels and stacked crates. John stepped onto his front porch, rifle held casually but ready. "There's no property of yours here, right? Just a free woman and her child who want no part of you. Best ride on back to Virginia City." His calm words carried clearly in the tense silence. Hannah watched from above as Matthew's face darkened with rage. She knew his pride would never let him back down now, not with his men watching. "That woman accepted my proposal and my down payment," Matthew snarled. "She's legally bound to me. And that child, well, a man has rights to any young'un living under his roof. Now stand aside, half-breed, or we'll go through you." His hand hovered near his holster as his men raised their weapons. John didn't move, didn't even flinch at the racial slur. He had faced worse odds before. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion to Hannah's terrified eyes. Matthew went for his gun, but John was faster, his rifle cracking before Matthew cleared leather. Two of Matthew's men fired wild shots as their leader fell, and John dove behind a stack of barrels as the air filled with gun smoke and the deafening sound of multiple firearms. Hannah pulled Grace away from the window as bullets splintered the wooden frame. Below, she could hear John returning fire methodically, making each shot count. But there were too many of them. Sooner or later, they would work their way around to flank the house. With tears streaming down her face, Hannah knew what she had to do. She couldn't let John die protecting them. Gathering Grace in her arms, Hannah raced down the back stairs to the cellar entrance. The tunnel would take them to safety, just as John had planned. But as she reached for the trapdoor, she hesitated. The shooting had died down to sporadic exchanges. She could hear men shouting, moving closer, and suddenly she knew she couldn't run. Not this time. Not from these men who thought they could own people like property. Setting Grace in a corner behind some barrels, Hannah whispered fierce instructions to stay quiet and still. Then, she took John's spare shotgun from its hiding place and crept back upstairs. Through a rear window, she could see three of Matthew's men trying to work their way behind the house. John was pinned down out front, unable to stop them. Hannah's hands trembled as she raised the shotgun, but her aim was steady. The blast caught the nearest man full in the chest, sending him sprawling. His companions dove for cover, not expecting fire from that direction. Hannah worked the action and fired again, forcing them further back. The moment of surprise was enough. John seized the opportunity to rush several yards to better cover, taking down another of Matthew's men as he moved. Now the odds were evening out. What followed was a desperate series of exchanges, with Hannah and John supporting each other's fire from different angles. Matthew's remaining men began to waver, clearly not having signed on for such determined resistance. When John's rifle found another mark, they broke and ran for their horses, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Hannah sagged against the wall, trembling with reaction as silence fell over the trading post. John found her there minutes later after checking that all threats were truly gone. Without a word, he gathered her into his arms as she began to sob. Grace came running up from the cellar, and they held her too, the three of them clinging together as family. They had faced the worst and survived, their bond stronger than ever. But Hannah knew this was only the beginning. There would be consequences, questions from the law. Yet somehow, with John beside her, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The sun was setting as they buried Matthew Wright and his fallen men on a small rise overlooking the river. Hannah insisted on helping, feeling it was important to show Grace that they respected life and death, no matter the circumstances. As John said a brief prayer in Cherokee, Hannah reflected on how this man's quiet strength and unfailing kindness had changed their lives. She had come west seeking security through marriage, but had found something far more precious: true love, freely given and bravely defended. That evening, as Grace slept peacefully nearby, Hannah and John sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. Their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining. "I should have run like you planned," Hannah whispered. "But I couldn't leave you to face them alone." John's grip tightened. "You did what your heart told you was right," he replied softly. "Just like I did when I took you both in. Sometimes the hardest path is the only honorable one." They talked long into the night, making plans. The law would come investigating soon, but John had friends among both settlers and natives who would stand with them. They would face whatever challenges arose together, as a family. And if they had to leave this place someday, they would do so on their own terms, not driven by fear or hatred. For now, they had each other, and that was enough. The peace of that starlit night proved short-lived. Just before dawn, John's Comanche friend Andrew arrived breathless at the cabin, having ridden hard from Virginia City. A group of bounty hunters, led by the ruthless Matthew, had been asking questions about Hannah and Grace. They carried papers claiming legal authority to return both mother and child to the spurned suitor in Santa Fe, who now asserted ownership rights through their broken marriage contract. John immediately set their emergency plans in motion. Hannah and Grace would travel north with Rebecca, a trusted friend who ran a trading post along the river, while he and Andrew gathered allies to make their stand. But Hannah refused to be separated again. "We face this together," she insisted, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Grace needs both of us now more than ever." The bounty hunters struck at midday, when the summer heat had driven most indoors. 6 riders approached the cabin from different directions, Matthew's silver spurs glinting as he led them down the dusty path. John stood on the porch, rifle ready but not raised. Hannah remained inside with Grace, both prepared to flee through the back if necessary, though she prayed it wouldn't come to that. "That woman and child are coming with us," Matthew called out, his voice carrying the practiced menace of a man used to being obeyed. "We've got papers saying they belong in Santa Fe. Step aside and there won't be trouble." John's response was measured but firm. "They're free people, not property. Those papers have no authority here." His hand never strayed far from his holster. The tension stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Then Andrew and 3 other riders emerged from the tree line behind the bounty hunters. More allies appeared from the river's edge, traders, settlers, and native friends who had benefited from John's fair dealings over the years. They had come to stand with the family that had earned their loyalty through kindness and respect. Matthew's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, realizing they were now outnumbered. But their leader wasn't ready to concede. "This half-breed's breaking the law," he snarled, reaching for his gun. Before he could draw, Hannah's voice rang out from the doorway. "The only law being broken is yours, against human dignity and justice." She stood tall, Grace held protectively in her arms, surrounded by people willing to defend their right to live freely. The confrontation reached its breaking point when Michael, the territory's circuit judge, rode up unexpectedly. He had been alerted by Rebecca and brought news that would change everything. The suitor's claims had been investigated and found fraudulent. He had attempted similar schemes before, using false papers to claim ownership of women and children across the territories. Matthew's face twisted with rage as his authority crumbled. He drew his gun with desperate speed, but John was faster. A single shot knocked the weapon from the bounty hunter's hand. The other riders quickly surrendered, their loyalty to Matthew's cause evaporating with his power over them. They rode away under escort to face justice in Virginia City for their part in the scheme. As the dust settled, Hannah and John embraced with Grace between them, their family bond stronger for having been tested. The community that had rallied to their defense stayed to celebrate, sharing a meal that became a feast of Thanksgiving. Around the fire that night, stories were told of other families who had found acceptance here along the river, where the waters carried away old prejudices and nourished new ways of living. Their victory represented more than personal salvation. It was a declaration that love and justice could triumph over greed and prejudice. The river trading communities had long been places where different peoples came together in commerce and cooperation. Now they had proven themselves defenders of a deeper kind of exchange, the sharing of lives and futures, the building of families based on choice rather than convention. As the stars emerged once again, Hannah watched Grace playing with the other children, her laughter mixing with theirs in the gathering dusk. John's arm around her shoulders felt like home, and the river's steady flow promised continuity and change in equal measure. They had found their place in this land of possibilities, where courage and compassion could forge new paths through old wilderness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the muddy streets of Virginia City, as David Wright stood before the gathered townspeople, his weathered face bearing the weight of his decision. The former bounty hunter had spent days wrestling with his conscience, finally choosing to stand with Matthew Harris and Hannah Lewis, rather than collect the blood money offered by John King. Matthew watched from the shadows of the trading post's porch, his hand steady on his rifle as David addressed the crowd. Hannah held her sleeping daughter Grace close, her heart pounding as their unlikely ally spoke words that would determine their fate. The mixed-race scout had never expected to find himself defending a mail-order bride and her child, but fate had other plans. John King's claim on Hannah Lewis and her child is based on lies and threats, David's voice carried across the crowd. I was hired to bring them back, but I've seen the truth with my own eyes. That man has no right to them, and I won't be party to enslaving an innocent woman and child. The gathered townsfolk murmured, some nodding in agreement while others scowled in disapproval. The past week had changed everything. When David arrived with his fellow bounty hunters, he'd found not the stolen property King had described, but a desperate mother protecting her child from a man who would use them both as pawns in his twisted game. Matthew's kindness in sheltering them, despite the prejudice he himself faced as a half-breed, had opened David's eyes to a deeper truth. The other bounty hunters had left days ago, but Michael Young remained, watching from the saloon doorway with cold eyes. He had sworn loyalty to King's gold, and David knew his former partner would report back everything. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as the town waited to see how this would play out. Victoria Harris, Matthew's sister who ran the river trading post, stepped forward to stand beside David. Her voice rang clear and strong. We've built this community on trade and trust. John King may have money and influence in Santa Fe, but here we judge people by their actions. Hannah and her daughter have found honest work and friendship here. They deserve our protection. The town marshal, Andrew Lewis, had maintained a careful neutrality throughout the conflict. Now he stepped forward, his badge catching the morning light. The law says King has no legitimate claim. Hannah came here of her own free will, and that child is hers alone. Any man who tries to take them by force will answer to me. Rebecca Wright, David's wife who had been caring for little Grace while Hannah worked at the trading post, emerged from the crowd with tears in her eyes. I've seen the bruises King left on Hannah when she fled. Are we truly considering sending a mother and child back to such a monster? Have we forgotten our humanity? The mood of the crowd shifted perceptibly as more voices joined in support. Matthew finally stepped into the light, standing tall despite the suspicious glances some still cast his way. I gave them sanctuary because it was right. I'll continue protecting them because it remains right. Any man who thinks differently can take it up with me. A shot rang out suddenly, sending people diving for cover. Michael Young had made his choice, but his bullet found only wood as Matthew's quick reflexes pulled Hannah and Grace to safety. David's return fire was precise, catching Young in the shoulder and ending the threat before it could escalate further. In the aftermath, as the marshal led Young away, the town made its decision. Hannah and Grace would stay, protected not just by Matthew's strength but by the community's embrace. David Wright found redemption not in bounty hunting, but in defending those who needed protection most. The river brought new trade and travelers daily to Virginia City, but now it also brought hope. Matthew and Hannah grew closer, their shared experiences forging a bond stronger than the prejudices that had once threatened to tear them apart. Grace flourished under the care of not just her mother, but a growing family of protectors. King's influence never reached them again. Perhaps he realized the cost would be too high, or perhaps the shame of David's public denouncement had finally pierced his armor of arrogance. The river continued to flow, carrying away old fears and bringing new beginnings to those who had found sanctuary in its embrace. Years later, travelers would still speak of the day Virginia City chose justice over prejudice, when a former bounty hunter found redemption by standing against his own kind, and when a community proved that family isn't defined by blood, but by the bonds we choose to honor. The trading post remained a sanctuary, its doors open to all who sought honest work and a fresh start. And if anyone noticed how Matthew's eyes softened when he watched Hannah teaching Grace to read, or how the little girl called him Papa when she thought no one else could hear, they kept it to themselves. Some stories don't need to be told aloud to be understood, and some families don't need explanation to be real. The autumn winds brought change to the trading post as surely as they painted the cottonwoods gold along the riverbank. 5 years had passed since that fateful confrontation, and the small community had grown into something none of them could have imagined. Matthew had expanded the trading operation, adding a proper schoolhouse where Hannah now taught not only Grace but a dozen other children from both settler and native families who had found their way to this unlikely haven. The old bounty hunter's scars had faded, though he still carried his weapons when riding patrol along their boundaries. But these days, his greatest joy came from teaching Grace to track and read sign, watching her natural talents bloom under his patient guidance. She had her mother's quick mind and determination, coupled with an uncanny ability to bridge the worlds of her mixed heritage, much like Matthew himself had done. Word reached them through river traders that John had met a violent end in Amarillo, shot down in a dispute over gambling debts. Hannah received the news with quiet reflection, lighting a candle in the trading post's window that night. Not for the man who had rejected her, but for the dream of acceptance she had once carried to these shores. Matthew stood beside her in silence, his presence more comforting than any words could have been. David had become a regular visitor, his legal practice in Virginia City thriving as he worked to secure rights for mixed-race families throughout the territory. He brought news of changes in the law, and more importantly, of shifting attitudes as other communities looked to their success as a model. The trading post's reputation had grown, a place where merit mattered more than ancestry, where children of all backgrounds could learn together without shame. Rebecca and Victoria had married local men, establishing homesteads nearby that served as way stations for travelers seeking the same sanctuary they had once found. Their children played with grace, creating a new generation that saw nothing strange in their differences. Abigail's cooking still drew praise from visitors, though now she supervised a proper kitchen that fed dozens at the community's regular gatherings. The river itself had changed its course slightly, cutting a new channel that Matthew said was a sign of nature's own acceptance of change. Grace loved to sit by its banks, sketching the wildlife and writing stories in a journal Hannah had given her. Sometimes she would read them aloud to Matthew during their tracking lessons, tales that wove together the legends of both her bloodlines into something entirely new. Andrew, the trader who had once brought Hannah's letter to Matthew, now made regular stops with his riverboat, carrying not just goods but also letters and news from other sanctuaries that had sprung up along the water routes. A network of safety had grown, offering hope to others who sought to build lives beyond the boundaries of prejudice. One crisp morning, as Matthew watched Hannah and Grace tend their garden, he finally spoke of something he'd held close for years. He told them of his own mother, a woman of mixed blood who had died believing her son would never find acceptance in either world. Hannah took his weathered hand in hers, and Grace wrapped her arms around them both, forming a circle that needed no explanation or justification. The trading post's bell still rang out each morning, calling people to work and children to lessons, but its tone had changed. No longer was it a warning of approaching danger or a call to arms. Instead, it had become the heartbeat of a community that had proven family could be built on choice rather than chance, on love rather than law. And so the river continued its eternal journey, carrying on its waters the stories of those who had found their way home. Matthew's ledgers now recorded more than just trades and debts. They held the names of families who had discovered that the strongest bonds are those we forge ourselves in defiance of those who would deny us the right to choose who we love and who we call our own. As winter yielded to spring, word reached the trading post that bounty hunters were moving upriver from Amarillo, led by Victoria's spurned suitor who still claimed legal rights to both her and Grace. Matthew's scouts reported 3 armed men making inquiries in riverside settlements, showing a fraudulent marriage contract and custody papers that could spell disaster if brought before an unsympathetic judge. Hannah worked through sleepless nights, sending coded messages to her contacts in Virginia City's legal circles, searching for precedents that might protect Victoria's freedom of choice. The territory's laws regarding marriage contracts were as muddy as the river itself, but Hannah refused to let paper bonds override the real ones that had grown between them all. The bounty hunters arrived on a fog-shrouded morning, their horses' hooves muffled by the damp earth. But they found no easy prey at the trading post. The community had transformed into a fortress of solidarity, with every door closed and every window watched.